Hello, my name is CB Bhattacharya, Director of the University of Pittsburgh's Center for Sustainable Business. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 50th episode of Sustaining Sustainability. Since the early days of the pandemic, we've been sharing short interviews with academic experts, industry leaders, government officials, and a wide range of sustainability professionals from around the globe to explore environmental, social, and governance challenges magnified by the COVID-19 crisis. As we recently celebrated the third anniversary of the Center for Sustainable Business, this podcast has become an ongoing part of our work, and I hope you continue to be as inspired by these conversations as I am. This week, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined from Cardiff, Wales by Sophie Howe, the Future Generations Commissioner of Wales, the first person to hold this globally unique position. During her term, Sophie successfully got the government to redirect funds towards public transportation solutions, away from roadway development, including a tenfold investment in cycling and walking routes targeted at neighborhoods with the highest air pollution and lowest life expectancy. Her office has championed the voice of young people with the new Future Fit school curriculum in Wales and extended voting rights to those as young as 16. Sophie is a mum of 5 and a career-long public servant. Sophie, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's great to be with you.
Sophie, almost half of your term has been during the pandemic. So how has this impacted the work you were doing in considering future generations and collaborating with other stakeholders?
There was a real fear that all this work that we've been sort of focusing on and recommendations that we were wanting to make to government and others would get lost in, the midst of dealing with the pandemic. And governments themselves sort of saying, actually, we can use this as a moment, it's such a disruptive moment, we can use this as a moment to perhaps reset. And so after or as we were emerging out of the first phase of the pandemic, I worked to produce a future generations plan for COVID recovery, which is based around a green recovery, based around not returning to the same old, traveling to work in your car 9 to 5, but looking at different ways of working and modal shift, looking at how we could start the economy through investing in green jobs and growth, through doing things like improving the quality of people's homes through retrofitting energy efficiency measures and the sorts of jobs that could be created through that. And actually the government took on board a huge amount of what was in that plan. So in some ways, whilst I thought it was going to be a problem, actually in many ways I do think that it's helped some of our politicians and some of our decision makers to rethink what they're doing.
That's interesting, right? Many of us thought that COVID would put sustainability and the future into the background. But I have heard in other places as well that instead it has provided that tailwind that we seriously needed. So that's great to hear. So what was your personal purpose at the start of 2016, and how has that changed now that you're nearing the end of your term?
What I wanted to do really was sort of constructively disrupt the way that we do things. And my overriding sense is that there's this real problem with us thinking in a short-term way. There's a real problem with the sort of policy silos that exist, and there's a real problem with us only ever focusing on something once it becomes an emergency or a crisis. Really, I wanted to try and find those people in public services who I call the frustrated champions. So these are people who for a long time might have been able to see that there's a better way of doing things. So the public planners who might be able to see, hang on a minute, 20 years ago, we were widening this road to deal with congestion, and we're now needing to do the same thing again. Nothing has changed. We're just coming up with the same old solution to the same old problem, and maybe there's a better way of doing it. They might be the people who are saying, if we make the connections between the quality of people's work and their health, there's a really clear correlation there to life expectancy, which is beyond anything our national healthcare system can do. So they're the people who are trying to sort of join up and take a long-term view on the system, and trying to find those people, use the Future Generations Act, which is a law. It's actually quite helpful when you want to change a system, to go and shake a piece of law at the lawyers in your local council or the finance director or whoever it may be, and say you actually now have a legal requirement to think and act differently, and to think and act in a preventative way, in a joined up way, and in a long-term way. But also, I guess, conveying the kind of importance of governance for future generations. So we often get focused on what are the big policy interventions, where's the money that's going to be spent to deal with the climate crisis, where's the investment coming from. What sits underneath that is a rotten system of governance, a system of governance that has no checks and balances on whether any of these new policy initiatives coming through are thinking about how they might impact on future generations, are joined up with anything else, or are kind of preventing any problems from occurring or from getting worse. Which is why I think what we've got in Wales is so important in terms of perhaps other countries learning some of those lessons, and actually reforming systems of governance as well, as because you can have all the policy initiatives in the world, but if at the core, the way in which you're taking decision is, still discounting the interests of future generations, then they will only ever be policy initiatives.
That is so very inspiring. Thank you for that. And let's dig deeper into kinds of things that you're doing. So for those unfamiliar with the 7 well-being goals that you have, what are they, how were they created, and how are they used?
It started with a national conversation that the government sponsored with the citizens of Wales, where they posed the question, what's the Wales that you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren, and future generations to come? What do you think are the things that are going to be important and are going to matter to future generations? And people told us, that they were proud of our rich natural resources that we have in Wales, and actually we wanted to protect them for future generations, that actually we wanted to address some of the inequality that exists in our society, that there was something about ensuring communities were cohesive and bringing people back together, and how could we move away from these sort of disconnected communities that have happened for a range of reasons, some of them infrastructure related, the way in which we plan, design and build communities, some of them because we're all too busy going off to our day jobs and working 9 to 5 and so on, that too busy to kind of connect to each other. They told us that they wanted us to focus on keeping people physically and mentally well in the first place, and they also told us that they felt it was important, particularly given Wales's industrial heritage. So we were at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution. The first £1 million cheque for coal was signed in our capital city. So we actually recognise our contribution to this climate crisis, but actually we are also a nation that now sees ourselves as a nation that should be globally responsible, and recognising that we have wrongs that we need to right. So the goal of a prosperous Wales, which is, I think, one of the most interesting ones, because you think prosperity, and I think the economists will immediately tell you GDP or GVA. And actually, our definition of a prosperous Wales, as set out in our law, is a productive, innovative, low-carbon society. It's one that uses resources efficiently and proportionately. It's one that acts on climate change, and it's one that focuses on developing a well-educated population with the skills to enable them to access decent work. Now, if you just pull it, one, the absence of GDP linked to, in terms of our definition of prosperity, but prosperity within planetary boundaries. And so, when you pair that then with the other 6 wellbeing goals about a resilience Wales, which is about maintaining and enhancing the resilience of our ecosystems, a healthier Wales, a more equal Wales. Wales, a vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, another interesting addition, because you don't see that kind of culture and heritage aspect coming through very strongly at all. And then, as I said, the goal of a globally responsible Wales. We were lucky that the Sustainable Development Goals were sort of in development at the time, so we drew learning from them, and we came up with these 7 long-term wellbeing goals, where all of our key public institutions have duties to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of those wellbeing goals, and then they must take all reasonable steps to meet them.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. And I think all cities and countries can take heart from defining goals, more specific goals at their community level. What is the value of ESG reporting by companies in alignment with the Welsh Future Generations Act framework? What are you doing to engage with business leaders And how do you envision that relationship growing and changing over time?
The Act as it is covers only the public sector. But actually, as the Act started to gain traction, sometimes from a negative perspective, from a business perspective, so conflict there, economy versus environment and so on. And there was a big sort of test case around the building of a 13-mile stretch of motorway, which was considered to be a kind of a done deal, which then got rejected by the First Minister because of my intervention and sort of the application of the Future Generations Act. And I think from then, there's also been this sort of recognition, okay, we have this law in Wales. Actually, there's something incredibly interesting and compelling for business to be working in a nation where a government has a clearly stated set of long-term goals, which are not going to change from one election to the next. You know, businesses like certainty, they like to be able to plan for the long term. And so increasingly what we're seeing is businesses actually sort of knocking my door and wanting voluntarily to apply the Future Generations Act. They're seeing that they can contribute towards this kind of Team Wales approach to meeting these long-term well-being goals. They're seeing it as a way to corral, you know, more traditional CSR things that they might have been doing, but to actually expand and extend that across these 7 well-being goals. And I think that's the real power of the legislation, that it provides this holistic framework that people can get behind and want to contribute to. Yes, it is a law, but it's also a vision for the Wales that I think we all want to see.
Quite true. You have championed a universal basic income trial in Wales, as well as green job creation and reskilling. How do you think this can contribute to a more equitable and thriving workforce?
Most countries in the global north do not have the skills in place which we will need to be able to deliver a transition to net zero. And therefore, we will need to, you know, have a big programme of reskilling in these areas in order to be able to deliver those targets. And this is where, you know, some of the challenges of government come in, because on the one hand, Climate Minister or the Housing Minister, you know, are setting sort of, you know, targets around low carbon homes, around restoring nature and so on. On the other hand, you've got the Economy Minister who's responsible for skills, and often they're not joined up. So some of the interventions that we've been making is joining the dots between government departments and saying, when we set this long-term vision, that gives you the go-ahead to start developing the skills pipeline through reforms in the education system, reforms to apprenticeships, to degrees. We're also starting to see some really exciting things happening in our school curriculum. What if, you know, the education system that you or I were in taught us to be ethical, informed global citizens? What if it placed creativity and creative thinking on a par with, you know, how good you were at maths and how good you were at science? We need an education system not just to enable us to go into another job, but actually to enable us to have a life well lived. And therefore, a focus on our physical and mental health is just as important. And so there's some really exciting things happening in the curriculum in Wales in that space. Children really reconnecting with nature. Every school has an eco council, for example. And then on a universal basic income. So when you look at the reasons for the difference in life expectancy, the biggest single contributory factor to that is income security. And what we're seeing is that people are sort of falling through the net, and the long-term cost of tackling poverty, so to the economy, to the health and well-being of citizens, and therefore to our public services, to our social services, becomes a huge, huge burden on the state. So actually, we'd be much better off actually investing first to keep people out of poverty. So I put forward a universal basic income as one of the ways that we should consider doing that, for a number of reasons. For that, you know, long-term intervention in tackling poverty, but also, you know, we can put money back into local economies when people have got more money in their pockets, when we're anticipating the future of work, so automation, artificial intelligence. So we can't just sleepwalk into a vastly changed, you know, world of work without preparing for some of these things. And that's why I think universal basic income could be part of a solution. This year, the Welsh Government have launched their first pilot of a basic income with a target group who are those young people who've been in state care. And we know that those young people are amongst the most disadvantaged group in society. So from the age of 18, those young people will have £1,600 a month for 2 years unconditionally, and we're wrapping a big evaluation programme around that to look at the benefits to those young people. And that is a really exciting start to something that could have this wider rollout.
Coming to another of your tremendous achievements, now you've applied a public health lens to transportation. So how did you do that, and how does that facilitate decarbonization?
Our legislation requires each of our local authority areas in Wales to establish something called public services boards, and they have duties to also make a collective contribution to the 7 wellbeing goals. And the key thing here is sort of looking at how do we join the dots, work beyond the boundaries of those particular institutions to recognise the connections. In Cardiff, they recognised that there were really clear connections between addressing the problems with transport modal shift congestion in the city centre with the health and well-being of citizens. So they actually seconded in a public health consultant to lead on the development of a transportation strategy. And so when you apply a public health lens to what started as a transport problem, you get a completely different set of solutions. So what we've started to see is the public health consultant saying, well, actually, I'm going to look at these levels of different levels of life expectancy from the south of the city to the north of the city. And what I can see is that in the south of the city, there's really high levels of air pollution. There's really high levels of physical inactivity. In the south of the city, there's very little access to nature and to public open space. So how do we think about both resolving the kind of congestion issue whilst addressing those issues too? They've built cycle lanes and new active travel walking pathways. They've done that in a way which is not just kind of built a cycleway with some concrete bollards. They've done it in a way which cleans and greens that community. And in doing that, they also solved a long-term problem, which is our obsession with concrete and a climate crisis is leading to these real big problems and challenges with flooding, because we don't have the kind of natural drainage that we might have had before we laid concrete everywhere. So what that is doing is taking thousands of tonnes of rainwater away from our decrepit sewerage systems and actually using nature-based solutions to deal with it. So that started as one small part of Cardiff. If anyone ever comes to Cardiff at the moment, you will see what looks like building work going on everywhere, but the building work is actually installing green infrastructure, installing nature-based solutions. It's not building more concrete, it's putting green roofs on our bus stops, it's putting sustainable urban drainage right throughout the city and building in cycleways. So this is where you start to get that exciting connection between improving our communities, tackling health inequality, helping to tackle our carbon emissions and helping to enhance and restore nature. And that's exactly what the Future Generations Act is asking us to do, to make those connections for the long-term benefit of the people and the environment in Wales.
We have so much to learn from everything that you're saying. Very sadly, we are coming to the close of our time. So let me ask you one final question. What call to action would you make to our listeners?
Start asking those questions of your institutions. How are you planning for and accounting for the needs of future generations? What exists in your systems of governance to ensure that the policy solution you're implementing today is not going to mess up tomorrow and is not going to make things much worse for future generations? And I think if we can get all of our citizens really challenging our institutions, not just on how policies are going to affect me in the here and now, but how it's going to affect our grandchildren, then I think, we have a real chance of fundamentally transforming the way that we do business, not just in Wales, but across the world.
Sophie Howe, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for taking some of your precious time to talk with us today.
Thank you. You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure too.
And before I sign off, I want to thank you again for tuning into our 50th episode of Sustaining Sustainability. Be sure to check out all of our past episodes on our website, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Give us a follow, leave a rating or review, and recommend an episode to a friend or colleague. All of these things help us in our mission to galvanize businesses to thrive for all stakeholders. This podcast is made possible with the help of my colleagues, Chris Gassman, who is Senior Associate Director at the Center for Sustainable Business, Kristen P. Ahern, Center Program Manager, and Gabby Pogel, a digital marketing specialist with the Center. I am your host, CB Bhattacharya, and I hope to see you in a couple of weeks for another edition of Sustaining Sustainability.